Welcome back to our growing experiment. We're here with Matthew from Ormir Organics. So he's going to tell us about composting and vermiculture. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your business and a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Well, first off, Sophia, Jordan, thanks for having me on our growing experiment. It's pretty sweet. I've heard a lot, got to listen to a few of the podcasts and everyone was like talking about it, those who participated and so on. So I was really grateful that you reached out. And so in terms of Ormy Organics, started really like it kind of came to be in terms of like its first inception, March 2020, when things just kind of hit the fan with, the pandemic. Thankfully, my current and full-time job still, I was very grateful that I didn't get laid off or anything, but we were working from home. And it just provided me time to start kind of really getting this, business more dialed in. So why we do, or I do what I do is, it's kind of this, it's been like a long journey of, I've always been really passionate about kind of environmental topics and kind of wondering why the world works the way it does, with very little regard to nature and, to ecological health and so on. And so I've been searching for really like many years, trying different little projects back and forth that I thought would kind of satisfy this like inner need to help change the world type thing. And eventually it just came across through my job in science communication. I got to discover the world of composting and specifically at the time vermicomposting. And I was pretty reluctant about it for some reason at first. I was like, not that excited. I was like, oh, okay, like it's, we'll see how this goes. And but as I got into it and saw, I think the biggest thing is seeing, what we deem waste, like an organic input, get transformed into like black gold, as they call it. It blew my mind. So when the pandemic hit, I kind of I did have this whole like worm population that I was taking care of. I took it home and then really, started to make this thing into reality. So, that first season was just, and still just learning the process of it. And the big part of why I do what I do is seeing the amount of food waste specifically that goes to landfill and how big of an impact it is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and just waste in general. Rather than going back to the soil where it belongs, it just ends up in landfill. And that's why we're trying to get. I'm just trying to get this off the ground and really hopefully see this through for the next many years. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. On one of the last things you were saying there, that kind of made me think. You mentioned the greenhouse gas output of, say, the waste going to the dump and just sitting there. Is it a lower output after it's gone through the digestion of the worms?
Yeah, for sure. So, it's pretty incredible to think. So, there are many ways that things are going to get digested in the world. And so, that's different fungi and, have different bacterias and so on and different organisms. And so what was really eye-opening was the fact that so when something goes, especially into landfill, it gets buried and it gets buried deep. And eventually oxygen gets cut off. And that's the biggest problem, is that when a system loses its oxygen, different microbes and different organisms take over the decomposition cycle. But because of the lack of oxygen, these organisms release methane. And so in a system where we would have oxygen, such as one with like vermicomposting or an active aerated compost like you would use in your backyards, that will release CO2. So there's always going to be an energy exchange. And so there's always going to be a release of a greenhouse gas. but the difference is from a methane concentrated system to a CO2 one. And now from the research and the literature and so on and science stuff, like it's saying that, methane as a molecule is, in the 20s to up to close to 30 times more powerful of a greenhouse gas than the CO2. And so that's where the importance of keeping things out of landfill and keeping things from going anaerobic or going without oxygen is important in that.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting too. Like, I wonder how much that could be applied on a bigger scale too, because if you think about, like, say, huge landfills, I mean, of course, you'd have to have another sort of sorting as we have with, like, say, recycling, right? But if the offset is that you're, say, cutting down your methane output by, say, 10%, 20%, and that's 20x what, say, a carbon output is, it might be worth the investment, right?
Absolutely. And you see, and I mean, no fault to these industries to kind of come up with this, but that's why you also see, and I believe Greater Sudbury is also doing like methane capturing in order to then burn it, so using it as a fuel. So, I mean, but you're right. Any little bit that gets, taken out of that equation, 10, 20%, like you're saying, X amount, that is an exponential amount of greenhouse gas removed. Yep.
Yeah, and let's say even too, like, you couldn't go totally to a vermiculture route if you could offset that little bit, right? Because even if they're doing the capture with the methane and they burn it, like, I kind of wonder too how clean you could burn that too, because then you're kind of offsetting, because obviously burning it's better than just releasing it, right? So
for sure.
And it's all harm reduction, right? And if that's what you can do, then that seems like a thing to do. And especially if you can turn that around into organic material that they can use in their backyards to grow healthy food, like better building blocks for their bodies, right?
Yep. Well, and that's it. It's like, so looking at everything as a resource, and you're right, like there's different pathways we can take, and if we choose to use it as an energy source, like using the methane and just continuing as status quo, absolutely, sure, like that, there are some forms, there may be benefits of doing so. But again, the other aspects in terms of, like, yes, you're capturing these organic gases, but then also there's like the idea of, like, we're not putting back that organic matter into the soil or where it belongs. And so, if the kind of predictions are correct and so on, and how we are running out of arable soils, within this century, like, so we got to really rethink how are we going to regenerate our soils. Another also point that I've kind of taken to address is just that of transportation. We know our food comes from all over the world, and there are many of us that are working towards a more localized food system. But then our waste also, gets picked up by a service, driven by massive trucks throughout our neighborhoods and emitting fuels. Why is it that, if we were just better equipped to know how to deal with that, like, why is it that those, especially who are privileged enough to have access to, like, say, a backyard, there's no reason why we can't be doing these things and managing our own organic, resources at home, and just, if at the end of the day, all you end up doing is tossing on your lawn to, fertilize it, like, that's great. So, yeah, it's a pretty complex and interesting, scenario we find ourselves in just organic waste management. And I never would have thought, though, that I in my life would be sitting here talking about it with you. So, yeah, so it's pretty cool, though.
Yeah, well, I definitely like that idea. That's like a thing we've talked about lots before, is like where our inputs and outputs are going, right? And that was even with the capturing the methane and all that kind of thing. The point that you made that was really critical there is all this material that could be organic material. Now, I mean, again, there's the sorting issue and whatever else, but this is potential organic material that can go back into, like, food production. And if we're worried about soil biology, soil life, we're worried about having land we can use to farm for food, then obviously we have to be using as much of our outputs, putting them back into inputs as possible, right? Like, it's a scale thing, because as I understand it too, part of the reason we're able to do food production on the scale we do is because of the synthetic fertilizer we use.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of one of these the venom and the poison are kind of wrapped together kind of thing. And instead of getting snake bite first and then having the antidote from the snake venom, you kind of get the antidote first and you get the venom after. I don't know how well that analogy works, but I think you get what I'm saying, right? And so the problem is now is we have a huge population because we have a huge food surplus.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're kind of burning that resource out and not putting something back into it. So we have to really start figuring out, like, you know, how we put these inputs back in, right?
Well, that's it. And I think that's yeah. And you know, there's many like accounts and scientific documentations and anecdotal stuff from people like discussing both sides of like we need like synthetic fertilizers. To then there's those who are like, no, we need to go organic and we can be actually potentially more productive, long term, short term, going that route. So that's not something that like I know too much about in term, but you know, but at the end of the day, it's like, but like you're saying, like the scale thing, if we're going to take X amount from the soil, we need to be sure that we're putting back X amount into the soil because it is like a natural cycle. And, you know, really great, you know, really great example of that. And really, this was kind of actually brought to my attention from a few friends from Sudbury Shared Harvest. But speaking of just like natural forest systems and how there's a carbon cycle that occurs just naturally. And we as humans are really good at like seemingly like thinking we can outsmart nature and like, oh, well, we can take from the soil indefinitely and that's that won't be an issue. But we know it's an issue now. And so we need to tap back into just those the natural cycles of you know, yes, we're here to live off the earth, so that's fine. But we just need to make sure that like that once it's used as a resource, we need to get it back into the natural cycle. So
yeah, well, even when you look back at like say older farming practices, like you go back medieval times and stuff like that, they're doing time where they're letting a piece of land go fallow, right? And they're rotating and they're doing that kind of stuff, but also they're using like their oxen and whatever to plow the field. So you have to imagine they're also putting manure in there. They probably have chickens running around and doing all kinds of stuff, right? So
yeah.
It seems like probably there were more of these sort of more symbiotic systems before. Maybe not quite as intricate or detailed as some people who plan them now. Like you see some people now who take these principles and really run with them and make these really complex systems where they're having farms that are doing meat production and stuff like that, and they're carbon neutral or even carbon capturing. And then when you think about that, because that's another criticism you'll hear about beef farmers sometimes is that because of the nature of what they're doing, they're producing a lot of methane.
Yeah.
Well, if you can integrate some of these sort of older, more traditional practices, we can actually cut a lot of that down. Also increase probably the living quality of the animal that we're going to be ultimately using its life for to further our lives. But we can create a much more humane, much more symbiotic, much more kind of caring sort of interaction, I guess, you know, like it's like, I think, but there's a lot of awareness. We're moving towards that, right? Like, I think things are tending in the right direction, but it's the, knowing the balance between being like really, really urgent, but not like over panicking. You know what I mean? It's like, we have to go fast, but we don't have to like go so fast we trip over our own feet kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and that's it. And you know, for sure. And going, you know, this is some of the stuff I'm going to say just a little off the cuff. Maybe it's just, you know, is the idea of like our food being generated by certain scaled farms, factory farms, and so on. And you know, of course, that there are impacts that have been really highlighted over the past few decades, especially on the negative impacts. But like you mentioned earlier, like we got to feed a certain population. You know, there's also like the idea of, you know, we've also just removed ourselves too far from the natural equation. Like we have these farms that are like these massive type of monocultured, you know, type establishments. but also we have people living in urbanized industrial, cities that actually don't participate in really any way in the natural cycle. Like if our population of people all just lived, you know, like rural lifestyle, and we all each had a cow to feed us for a year, then there might not be as much of that. Like this conversation may not happen on like, oh well, the methane production of these animals. But one, it's concentrated in one location, so it's like very evident. There's also like the ethical issues with like having animals just tightly packed together like that, and then there's the environmental issue. And but it's just like it. Yeah, I think that there's a way out of this. Our problems. But again, I think it's like you've said, like and we're kind of advocating is like reintegrating all of society back into the natural cycle. And so, I think that plans for finding ways to reintegrate cities back into a natural landscape is one of them. Again, that's a little far off from the composting thing, but it all is related in many ways, and I think that that's where and why we're so all passionate about these types of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, it certainly is, and yeah, I had something to say, and then I was going to jump in, and then you said something, and I forgot it.
Well, I was just thinking about how you talked about the compost, and it's true. If it's like you said, if we all had a cow, we would be able to feed ourselves, that kind of idea. Well, we could do some of that with the composting, like you're saying, right? Where we're taking that care of that ourselves. That basically allows us to be more independent in that and not depending on certain systems to take care of that for us, right? It's better to be able to do it ourselves, I would think anyway, than have to have a whole structure in place. And
I remember now what it was. It was talking about how basically the upside again to like sort of the cities in a way, right? Is a lot of people sort of like convenience and all these other kind of things too, right? Because the other sort of point like is you have to have initiative to do all these things, right? And it's an interesting thing because when I see people sort of thinking about future solutions, like I hear a lot of that, but then also sort of not the opposite, I guess, but like another way of thinking about that too is like you'll hear about these 15-minute cities, right? You'll hear about like, let's reduce the movement of all people just generally in the cities, and that will basically the same idea, right? You're cutting down sort of transport routes to basically cut down on how far you're shipping food and this, that, and the other thing to cut down ultimately on your emissions. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting to hear those kind of things. I definitely favor the kind of rural thing, but I also favor the initiative and all that because I think there's also a lot of byproduct that comes from that. I think when, especially of all the contact we've had with farmers and a lot of people involved in this space, it's a lot of people who took initiative, right? It's people who said, you know what, I'm going to do something. And that's really the thing, right? And that's where a lot of our podcasts too, I think a lot of the times we end up sort of preaching to the converted in a way because it's like people who take initiative and want to know more about people who took initiative to sort of help further along their project, which is good because you need that positive feedback loop. So like, I don't know, it made me think of like, that's sort of an interesting thing as we're looking into the future and trying to figure out what it is we're going to do to sort of solve these problems that we have. Right.
Yeah, for sure. And like, if anything, and if anything in our, like in the context we find ourselves in this like mixed bag of urban and rural, communities and the food producing sectors and of our population, and those who are more on the consumer side, it's finding even at least a way, again, to get that organic matter that's been consumed from the city back to the land where it came from. Like at least that would be like something, and even that's not really happening. Like I don't think, with the friends that I have in the farming community, like there's no like, I don't know much of a program that's really established that's saying, hey, yeah, we're taking, compost from the city or organic waste, bringing it back to the land to like regenerate the soil. Like it's completely cut off. It's completely linear where it's like from farmlands to mouths to landfill. Mm-hmm. And so again, maybe I'm just naive on something that may be out there, but yeah, we're definitely though like if that were to be the case, which I kind of do believe that might be the case, is like we are just shooting ourselves in the foot. We definitely need to start looking at more of a circular based economy, and again, just regenerating that soil.
Well, and that kind of reminds me of an interview we had recently too, where we were talking about how people are using the internet now as leverage to put these consumers in urban places in contact with producers in rural areas. And I think that might be a good point. I think they made the same point too, that this integration might be what's key, right? Like actually we need big consumers to have outputs that we can have for big inputs, so we can have like it's that kind of circle thing you're talking about, right? But
Yeah.
maybe that's kind of like a way going forward where we start thinking about, like, say, as these cities, like they maybe should have an initiative where whatever compost they make, maybe they, but I don't know how much compost they're making either too, and how well we're doing as a city, say, of making sure we're sorting our food. Because let's say however many households there are in Sudbury and Greater Sudbury, how many people are really actually throwing their stuff into the compost? How many of it ends up just going in the trash anyways, and so on.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, and like, yeah, I totally agree. So there is like a responsibility at all points within, this exchange of energy, like, exchange of goods or whatever. It's like there is, from how foods are produced and how soil is managed, again, at the production end is important, like exceptionally important, to then how, it's consumed and then also, sorted for, again, like kind of managed, like waste management, and that's at like kind of the consumer level in terms of like us eating the food. And yeah, so that it's kind of complex. And I know one thing that's kind of stood out to me in the past while, which I think somewhat relates to this is like how, and even myself for most of my life, I've not grown up valuing food or food production. And we see that, and through like our migrant worker, kind of policies and like culture that we've created. And by all means, like I welcome anyone who's wanting to, get out there in the fields and do work. But it's like going back to like the front lawn. Like what an odd concept where like, why wouldn't you, if not at least let nature just stay natural and do its thing, or use it as a space to grow food, but seeing how, in a way, like systematically, like we've been removed and disconnected from food production, and it's been devalued, and so I think it's just like this odd tendency for humans to want to appear as though they are like wealthy, and so anyway, as time has just gone on, now here we are, like people can't even take the time. And I'm not trying to blame anyone. I'm just like, it's just, I think something that they've intrinsically fell into is just, we can't even value the time to sort. Like you're saying, like, it's like, oh, it doesn't matter to me. It just goes in the trash, gets picked up every week. That's it. And so,
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny thing because, like, I listen to, I try to read as many books and I try to listen to as many people talk about it, like sort of human nature and stuff as possible. And that's one thing I was listening to even recently, just the nature of humanity to kind of do like the wrong thing in a way sometimes. But to give us credit in some sense, a lot of the times, like something that looks really good and is really good for a long time also turns out to be the bad thing. Where it's like, it's like there's no this magic bullet kind of thing where we can set things right, because there's this sort of human nature thing you're always kind of fighting against. And we have these tendencies, like you said, to want to show off wealth or have status. We have this sort of, some philosophers say, like a will to power sort of thing, where we want to be able to show how we can exert ourselves and all this kind of thing. Yeah. But it's, you kind of get it in a way too if you consider us in a more natural context, where if you think about, like, say, natural man or man living closer to nature and the sort of fighting against nature in a sense to survive, right? Like, I think it's a good idea that we romanticize nature and wanting to get back to nature in a lot of ways, and definitely have more of a reciprocal nature. But I also sometimes forget, or I think we forget, the sort of the shadow side of Mother Nature, right? Where it was also really the law of tooth and claw. Like, it was really like you were fighting for survival all the time. It was like, if you didn't have your food harvest, you starved to death. If your kids wandered too far from the town, they got eaten by wolves. So, like, there's a lot of that too, right? It's these trade-offs. So, like, when you think about why people would want to grow so much food with the synthetic soil, when you're busting your back working on these farms up until like the 30s, basically still like using lots of animals and stuff. Really, it's not until really we have a surplus of mechanism from the war that we're able to industrialize these farms on big scales. So, like, it's
Well,
like there's sort of these. Anyways, I've been talking long enough, and if you want to jump in there.
but well, I I think that there's a great book I've been reading, and it has nothing to do with composting or but it's I have to share this with people. Is this it's Pierre Berton's The Arctic Grail. So it's if you've not read any or heard of Pierre Berton, just like one of these, he's one of the iconic Canadian type authors, journalist, but of kind of what you're mentioning of like this like battle with nature of sorts, like in this and within his tellings of like Arctic exploration and looking for the Northwest Passage, the North Pole, and interactions with like early, this is the 1800s, but like Hudson's Bay Company and so on, and fur trades and interactions with all the indigenous people across the land. It was funny. There was this like weird tendency that like those from Britain specifically, mostly, those were the main characters throughout the book, is that they were always trying to just do things their own way, in a sense, and they would not take into account like indigenous knowledges, and even when they interacted with them, like many of them, they would like they would shy away from it, or they would like look down upon it. So things like harvesting big game, many of them people were not interested in that because they felt above that. It was just a part of their upbringing in Britain. The individuals, though, who were successful, like who were exceptionally successful, really adopted and embraced indigenous ways of knowing and being. And, the accounts of certain people like John Ray, one of a like fur trader type character, who helped in certain Arctic exploration and kind of recovery missions that they were sending out. He'd be gone for like a year and a half, and they're like, oh, him, they're like, oh, Ray and his party are dead for sure. They'd come back like fatter and healthier. And when you worked within the systems that were provided by nature, I think that there's real possibility for that finding a more harmonious relationship, while still, again, these aren't people speaking of like, let's build 5,000 square foot homes and like have 3 luxury vehicles or nothing like that. That's not the world they're living in. Not that those things were available at the time, but but they were able to live obviously a productive life. And I think that's is important to understand. And also culturally, for those who will listen in, and like if they've not listened to Winona LaDuke speak, she's an Anishinaabe Kwe from White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, and she just speaks even on Western culture and our economy, and she speaks of it as the Wendigo economy. So this this character, this cannibal character from Ojibwe, stories and legends, and how we speak on human nature and like our tendencies. And I think that the stories in which we tell ourselves and our children and their children pass on to them, really either they will quell certain selfish human tendencies, or they will promote it. And in a sense, we live in a world where consumption and overconsumption is like celebrated. So I think there's a few things that, and that's where it's like culturally we need to be on point with how we reintegrate ourselves into the natural systems. And then two, we actually got to take the initiative, like you were mentioning. Not many people want to do that, but then we also have to have that will to get out there and do it and see the value in doing that. And I think that most people just don't see the value. And again, it's not because they can't, it's just, they just don't know that it's possible. So yeah, so going super far from composting in some respects, but not really. I think it's like when we can listen to what nature needs and spending time out, and I think that's where farmers and people who spend time on the land, when they sit there and listen to it, they might not always make the right choices, or they might not always have the right answers, but at least in some respects they're trying. And I think that this type of enterprise, like that I'm also trying to get into, it's like, by all means, it's not perfect, but it's a stepping stone towards learning and reintegrating this into my own life so that I can pass it on to my kids and so on, and people around me. So yeah.
Well, I think I'll use this opportunity to kind of segue a little bit, because it makes me think, like, what we're talking about is people kind of getting their hands dirty. And I was thinking hands dirty reminds me of working with worms. Is it really the case that you're getting really dirty when you're working with worms, or are they fairly clean, or how smooth was that? Not smooth? Smooth?
Yeah, no, it's like, I think, okay, so there's a few things. So one, it's a wonderful way of managing organics if you, especially in some ways, don't want to get your hands super dirty. What I've found, so there's a few, not issues, but just a few considerations when it comes to vermicomposting. Is so from literature that I've read and things that I've come across, it's that I've been informed to think that no worm was native to North America, and so our forests and our forest floors have not evolved with them being present. So we had, there were just other decomposers out there. So at times my concern may be, the introduction of a certain species, and through the composting, then their eggs get deposited elsewhere, and that, so I'm just perpetuating an invasive species to colonize our lands. But from what I've seen is the red worm that is like kind of the main vermicomposting industry's like workhorse. They're not like they're a type of worm that does not dig very deep. They don't burrow very deep. So our frost line usually, especially on cold, in the cold winters, could even it'll kill them off, and it'll also kill their cocoons off. So that's one consideration for the vermicomposting. And so with that being said too, when you're trying to do it, there are massive industries in the U.S., but a lot of them are either indoors or in the southern parts of the states. To try to do this outdoors, you can. Like online, there are successful people who seem to, like, in, say, a hot compost pile with like enough mass, you can keep a certain worm population alive even through a cold winter. Will production slow down if that's what you're looking to do? 100%. Like that's just going to happen. They're going to slow down, and they'll just restart up when things are back and going. But in terms of the cleanliness and getting hands dirty, yeah, like it's nice because they really do. So you don't usually, because they don't go down that deep, and they're very heat and they're temperature intolerant at certain heats, and also when it gets too cold. They're great because they're going to keep things aerated just through their movement. So that's nice because you don't have to turn the compost. But you just have to make sure that you're not overheating a system and killing them off, or getting it too cold and killing them off. So it's like, that that's kind of like been the learning curve of how do I do this in a way that I can do it year round, be like, fairly productive throughout the whole year, without really having big disruptions in the population. So yeah, I think, and then at the end, when it comes to like handing it out to people, for a long while I was looking at this idea of like, oh, this beautiful like fluffy compost, like, and that's kind of what you get sold on. It's like, oh, like it's really aerated. But then I realized going into this, like, and this is like the sifting process and where in which you get dirty, is what you're really doing is disrupting the ecology of that system. And for me, if I can just grab like a good handful of it, put it into like, somebody's container that they can take home with them. To me, like if I'm not sifting it and completely disrupting like the bacterial and especially the fungal, networks, I think somebody's going to get a better results when they put it into their own, system, into their soil. So I'm kind of steered away from doing that sifting. So yeah.
Okay, so 2 questions I got on there is then, so how are you kind of like doing your production now? Like, what's your sort of setup like? How are you keeping them warm, that kind of thing? And then, sorry, go ahead with that first thing there. Sorry.
No, yeah, okay. Well, so bit of trial and error. If you look at the many systems out there, so there are like tray systems that people could get for home. So multiple trays stacked on one on top of another, well, giving you about 6 to 8 inches of depth per tray, which is a kind of a good number to work with because nothing will ever, no compost or like no organic matter is going to get that hot to kill off your worms. So there's that. I don't do that system. That's more of like residential. Then you have like on the other side of it, you have like these big like flow through systems, which are like huge, almost troughs that are a bit deeper, but they funnel down and you can harvest from the bottom. Feed from the top, harvest from the bottom. Those you can find them, especially in places like California. There's huge players in the industry down there that they'll have tents kind of above to keep the temperature down, but that's their game. What I'm doing, I first started off with like, I work out of a shed, essentially an insulated shed, and I first did like tray systems. But the problem was I was finding that it was either getting too wet or it was drying out too fast. And so I'd then try to like cover it, and would just like, I'd get have some plastic on hand from the build. So I'd like put like line it with plastic, but that didn't really work that well either. So I eventually adopted more of like a bin system, which has like aeration. So just, if you want to easily envision, you just envision like a Tupperware bin, which kind of what I'm using right now. I'm shifting towards building out of wood to avoid any plastic use. But, that's where I'm working out. So many plastic heavy duty bins with holes drilled throughout to aerate, but enough coverage with the lid on to keep the moisture in, for a pretty fair amount of time. Like, and that to me, I found be the most efficient, where I've found that, and people who vermicompost would know, like you could literally probably put a bin. Like I've heard accounts of people like, they're like, oh, I left my home in New York State and I like went down to Florida for 4 months and came back and my worms were doing better than they were before. If you have a decent system, they kind of self-regulate. They do their thing. So that's more of where I'm at, is like, I cannot see, like I mark my bins out, like, label them on when I last put a feeding or whatever it was. And sometimes it is like a month that I've not looked inside of a bin, but that's okay. Whereas in previous systems, I would have maybe just killed off the whole population. So yeah, so if anyone's interested in doing something, especially say in like their basement or at home, you could just use an upcycled bin like that and just, start off small and slow. And
Are you using anything to check the temperature of the soil?
no, I'm not, because the building itself is temperature regulated, and that they're not so big, like they're not such thick bins that like I know that it's going to overheat. I don't really have a desire in checking them, and a little bit, it's a little counter intuitive to like my interests in like in sciences and so on, and kind of like you want to get really like into the nitty gritty. But I've also realized that like I'm trying to adopt the thing that just like let nature do its thing. And if I do blunder somewhere, then fine. Like I have to learn from that mistake. But like I'm not getting too specific on things. I don't check pH, right off the hop. Like I don't do that on throughout the production. But and this year is specific, as I will be getting all of the soil tested for a lot of that, for pH, for the trace minerals and so on. So, yeah.
Well, that'd be kind of interesting to see how it naturally regulated and see what your pH levels are versus optimum, right? See if they did a really good job of self-regulating. Yeah. And then that kind of reminds me of what my second question was, which basically was the no sift that you were talking about. You mentioned that part of it was maintaining the environment and that kind of thing. Are you sort of atypical in that kind of practice? And I mean, you made mention of the worms doing better and stuff like that. So maybe just some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's maybe it's atypical. Really, I guess it would be. I guess it's going a little bit against the grain from what you could see online and from what seems like big manufacturers even do. But again, I think that there's this tendency, like, for people to want perfect looking soil or perfect looking compost, like, homogeneous compost. Like the people like love that. It's like, oh my goodness, like it's just all the same. But nature's not like that. Like nature's not just like all the same. You like that diversity in like from grain size to and all these things matter. And I think that that's more of the direction I'm wanting to go with it. And also, to be quite honest, it's just like it's just easier to sift through compost. It's painstaking. It takes a long time. And now knowing, like, and really, and going into the scientific aspects of it, like learning more about like, fungal populations and so on, like it's just disruptive. Like you're actually doing the soil worse. So it's almost thinking about tilling. Like there's this whole movement on like no till. And by all means, I'm not a farmer, so I'm not like saying, oh, if you till, that's a bad thing. But there is this like discussion happening. And that's how I'm seeing it, is like, well, if tilling seems to disrupt these natural like ecosystems and these populations of organisms, then probably my sifting quite vigorously is also doing the same. So so I just adopted a new way of like I just really do like a baiting system. So when I go to harvest, say, a bin, it takes a while. Like it's give it a month or two process, because I will bait with like foods, in a sense, like a food source for the worms, put it in a spot, and within say 4 or 5 days, they will just like migrate and like engulf whatever I place there. And then I grab them out, put them into a new bin. I'll do that like once or twice so that I ensure like I've gotten almost all of the worms out, especially the mature ones. I'll let it dry out a bit so that it's like a better consistency. Like if it's a little too wet, I'll let that kind of like aerate. So I'll take the lid off and just like let it sit. In that time, new cocoons could and will hatch. I'll do another round of like extraction of worms. And then it's like, I can like, so now what I have available soon is it's just the compost. And so it's like, I go through it and I'm like, oh, there's no more worms in there. And there'll be maybe a few little sticks here and there, but for the most part, just because the inputs I put in, like there's not like tons of woody things or anything. Like it all gets broken down, from leaves to shredded paper to any other like coffee grinds or whatever it is. All that stuff, you don't notice what it is at the end of the day. So again, going back to the need for sifting, it's kind of less so.
That's kind of interesting, like thinking about how you get them out of there, right? You just put some food there. They go to the food, you grab and you put them out, and then you just put them in a new bin, and then you're just going to put a bunch of food in there and rinse and repeat, right? And you do that until you get all the worms out of there. So that's kind of cool. So you get 2 or 3 bins. Like I can kind of see on a smaller scale. And if you're talking about feeding, how often would you say you're feeding them? Like you said, once a month. And I guess that depends on how much matter you're putting in, what kind of matter you're putting in.
Yeah, true. Depends on what I'm putting in. Like the first, so one of the inputs as well, like I'll put a layer, like probably a good like 5 or 6 inches layer. I go up about 12 inches in the bins. But the first 4 or 5 inches is horse manure, which I've vetted that the feed that they're getting and the hay has not been sprayed, because there's a problem with herbicide concentration after being ingested by say a horse or herbivore. So I'll use that. So what's great about that is on top I'll do leaves, just like fall leaves, coffee grinds and shredded paper, cardboard, food, and then the food waste and so on. They can in that initial stage, I could probably let them sit for 2 months, easy, and their population will adjust to the environment. They will populate it to a point where it's they're going to max out the population for that square footage, and they'll have essentially food for months. So that's a really good thing. But once they've kind of reached that and they've converted it all into a vermicast, then the feeding is more regular, because you're starting to build up more and more as they eat. They're top feeders, so they're just always converting mostly with at the top. So so then the feed schedule is say once a month, because at least then I can ensure that the most important thing too that people should understand if they're doing this at home is you don't want to overfeed, because if you overfeed and if they can get too wet or whatever, you could get pockets of anaerobic digestion happening, and so you'll get that smell. So you don't want that. You want to make sure that the worms have ingested what you've placed already before you add anything new. So, yeah.
Okay, so you go and you check up on them, and so you just keep feeding them basically until you have what you figure you need for a harvest of your vermicasting, you called it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you do that until you got your desired amount. Then you'll do your transfer, and then are you doing again another base layer of say horse manure, and then doing the feeding on top of that?
Yeah. So once I transfer them out, then I restart the whole system.
Okay.
Horse manure. One thing I noticed, and especially more trying to do this small scale commercially, if you're at home every day and you want to check your worm bin and so on, and which you should hope I used to do all the time, you can spritz a little bit of water if it's getting dry, but you'll notice certain materials, say shredded paper at times, if left really unattended, it'll dry out quite rapidly. What's great about the manure layer is that it retains a good amount of moisture for a long period of time. And until you get a good base of the vermicompost built afterwards, you'll have to manage your moisture levels. And so again, that first layer of horse manure is kind of it's this safety net. It's a great input. The worms love it. It's a great organic source to convert. But to me, it's also my safety net, more of a commercially, where it's if I couldn't check on this bin for 2 months, I know that there's enough moisture retention in that substrate layer that'll keep the population alive till I get to them. Because otherwise, if it dries out, well, then they dry out and got to restart. So
you just have the one variety of worms you use?
Yeah. So I initially purchased some. I never thought I'd spend the amount of money I did on my first on worms. But they're just like the red worms. It was through Kathy's Composters. She's just a little further south. She has a website. She does kind of I don't want to say like she does what I do. She's into vermiculture, and so sells the worms, sells like the equipment for home-based worm composting, and sells some vermicast as well. And yeah. So anyways, if anyone's interested, they can check out our website at Kathy's Composters. Yeah, so I do use one. I'd have to say I'd have to say as well that there at times are like probably some night crawlers and so on, like some just those dew worms that you get naturally. Because when I get the horse manure, it is aged, so it's not fresh. Like it's probably aged for about a year at least. There's just worms that are living out in our forests now already, so they'll probably get in there. It doesn't really matter too much. I mean, the majority of the population, I'd say 99% of it is the red worm. But there are also other types of worms being used in commercial composting, like the African nightcrawler. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. Like I'm not sure. I was just kind of brought into this game thinking like, well, the red worm's the one to go with, and that's what I went with. But if others want to use other worms, I'm sure that there's differences in the chemical composition of their vermicast and their their castings. But is it a potato thing? Like, I don't know. I guess there needs to be more scientific research to really determine that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So let's say in thinking about like different kinds of worms, like let's say you go out in the backyard and you put your spade in the ground there and you got like your earthworms in there. Are they kind of doing the same thing that those red worms are doing on a different level? Are they like living in a different layer? So like, what are they kind of like? What are they kind of doing?
Yeah, no, that's exactly. They're pretty much doing like the same type of thing. They don't, and that's where maybe I don't see that many of them as much, because they don't seem to, like, from my understanding, tolerate shallow soil depths. They do burrow deep, and that's why they persist so well throughout our winters. So they are just different species, different adaptations, and but at the end of the day, yeah, like they are decomposing and ingesting fungi and organic matters and bacteria and turning it into their own casting. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't advocate going out. Like, you can try. If you want to go out and experiment with getting some worms after a rain and trying to vermicompost with them, like, why not? And if it's successful for you, and if you find good results with whatever you get out of it, then great. Just not the road. And that's just not the road I went down. So. Yeah.
I was thinking just even in the level of like when you're, say, top feeding your soil or whatever else, they're probably eating some of that and stuff too. Like, say if you're adding a layer of compost on top, I guess maybe they'd come up and get some of that, or maybe they're probably staying more for like, cause they wouldn't come up to feed. Like you mentioned that the red wrigglers are like top feeders, right? So I guess that. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And like, so they probably would come up. I mean, we like that. I can't see. I don't really know their behavior completely, but I can't see, like, I mean, we do interact with these worms on almost a daily basis if you spend time out in the land in the summer times, especially, like when things were all thriving. So yeah, they definitely come up for whatever reasons. So I'm sure they feed close to the top, but it just seems like the red worms themselves are just more adapted to like that top layer of soil. And again, it seems like they don't have the behavior to burrow deep beyond a frost line to preserve themselves into a new year. So, yeah, which again, though, is why those big flow-through systems that have been created, like these big troughs, like, although they're deeper, most of that near the bottom, like all of the worm casting that gets formed and gets kind of pushed down below as feeding happens on top, you're not going to get worms at the bottom because they're always just working the upper regions. Mm-hmm. So,
is there some things that you wouldn't want to put in your vermiculture compost bin?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big thing on like meats and fats, and so on, like oils. breads, things like that tend to do well. They don't really do well in that type of system. It'll disrupt it. Just things like so. I think going back to we're talking about like maybe a little bit about the soil chemistry is the worms are tolerant of certain ranges of pHs and certain temperatures. There's also tolerant to certain salinities and so on. And I feel like if I can provide they're pretty like things got to be pretty neutral for them to just like for them to thrive. And if my populations are thriving, well, they must be within those ranges because otherwise they just all die. Adding inputs like certain like meats and so on can quickly disrupt their world. And we got to think if we just had a massive field of things, like if you think of nature where you're like, well, if an animal passes and, well, other things are going to decompose, that organic matter, and then eventually worms could make their way in and finish off whatever. But when we're working in these small systems, those things have a really big impact. But one thing that's been successful in working with Nowhere Public House is for them, because they do serve meat products and cheeses and so on, and oily based things and cooked things and spiced whatever. We can't just toss that into a vermibin. But what we do is we bokashi compost it, and so that's a whole like fermentation process that happens over, and that's an anaerobic process, happens over several weeks in a closed bin. And then that has, I've yet to really, go full in on like putting it all into a worm bin, but like that itself can then be put into a vermicomposting system. I've just not like gotten to the point where it's like I'm fully putting in like a whole bucket of bokashi compost, which has all those things in there just yet. So what I'm doing first is hot composting them afterwards into a pile. You can take the bokashi, you can dig it a trench in the soil and just like toss it in. It'll go away. But I'm like putting it in as another input into a hot composting outdoor bin. And as I do that, then I can take that compost and, if desired, then introduce it to a vermicomposting bin. So.
Okay. Yeah. So I'd ask a little more about what that bokashi is. And then also I was kind of thinking worms, they must have to wait till like the food source you've put in basically starts to break down, or there's other sort of insects that break it down, and then they break it down from there. Like, because I mean, they don't eat, right? Like food like that way.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. Like they're part of a system that's just like, it's a bunch of different organisms breaking down the food. And then their goal is to, ingest, from bacteria to fungi to smaller, organic matter pieces. Like that's what they do. But yeah, you're right. Like you can't almost anticipate, although it may look like if you put, say, a banana in the middle of your worm bin, they'll go around it and they'll get at it. It almost may seem like, oh, well, they're just chomping straight on that thing, but there's other organisms at play, for sure. So yeah, it's a great question.
Maybe a silly question, like they have mouths, I guess.
Well, yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It's really small. I mean, I've never seen a worm's teeth,
Minimum.
Exactly. Wow. Yeah, I mean, you must, right? It's got to go in and got to go out at the end of the day.
Right?
You don't see it.
No.
I've never looked close enough, I guess. I never really.
If you look close enough, and that's what's really cool, is like you do, like, and you don't need like a microscope or nothing. Like I could see it in plain day on my hand, especially with the red worms because they're seemingly like a little more like translucent. You could see inside in the digestive tract, and you could see like little black specks, which is them digesting. Like that's just the organic matter that's eventually going through and coming out the other end. Okay. So, yeah.
Well, okay, so yeah, I guess they're eating just like little bits of what's broken off, already partly broke down, and then they're kind of enriching it with their breaking it down and making it another form that's more absorbable, say, to plants, right?
So looking at all the scientific literature, that's where, when especially they're talking about compost and then the different forms of it, when they're calling like, things like black gold, like for some And again, I think some of this is still really unknown to us. It's just like there's something that occurs, especially within the digestive tract of these worms, that, like you said, must obviously convert, certain nutrients into more bioavailable nutrients. They must introduce certain, like bacterial populations into the worm compost itself afterwards that help plants just properly or in a way more efficiently take up these nutrients. So yeah, there's stuff out there you can read on it, but it just seems like, worm compost is a pretty like powerful type of compost out of all the different forms. But also is one that is like exceptionally safe. It's not like a fertilizer where you're like, oh, if you put too much, like if it's too high in nitrogen or so on, it's going to burn, the root systems and so on. Like this stuff is neutral. You can, like it's incredible, not as much in the bins, but when I would do this in the trays, like in their just open air, if I were to say any seed that would fall into the system, it looked like I wasn't even doing composting. It looked like I was trying to grow sprouts or something. Like the whole thing, everything just like blew up. So everything germinated, which then also is actually kind of a positive thing because I don't really worry about having seeds present in the compost because everything that gets put in there germinates. It sits there long enough that it's going to germinate. It's not going to survive. Obviously, it's really a proper environment to continue to survive. It gets reintegrated into this compost, and so that's been a thing too. I've never heard of anyone or myself having an issue with, oh, well, that's a weird, foreign seed that came in. So, yeah.
Okay. And then also, so the Bokashi compost you mentioned, what is that? What makes that different?
Yeah, but the Bokashi compost, yeah, it's so Bokashi is it's a Japanese derived form of composting. It was kind of developed in a sense, like they figured out that like using, so you get like what they call the Bokashi brand. You can I think there's a few sites that people can go and buy this stuff on if they're interested. So it's just an inoculum. So really what it is just like it's this grain of sorts, or like the husk of a grain or something that they use. Then they get a bunch of lactobacillus bacteria, onto it. They like slowly dry it. The bacteria go dormant, and when you put it into a system, so then you can this is a great system because you can there's no we've talked about sorting. People are annoyed by sorting things out. You don't have to sort anything. You just toss it in. Every few layers, you sprinkle a little bit of this, the Bokashi brand. Once you fill up your bin to the top, you can kind of squish it down, keep filling it up, a little bit of sprinkling. Once it's done, once you're to the brim, you just we're using, just 20-liter pails. You just get that lid on there, make sure it's firmly secure, and you let it sit for, they say minimum 2 weeks. You can let it sit for 3 weeks, a month, whatever it may be. But it takes all that. Then with the moisture levels and so on, just from the stuff being in there, it kicks up the population of lactobacillus bacteria. They take over amongst probably other bacteria and fungi and whatever else is living in there. Things take over. It goes anaerobic. It literally pickles the foods. So, and every time then, so it's so when I go and I crank these things open, it has this really not a bad smell, just kind of what say a pickle jar would smell like, just that fermented food smell. And you could see the noticeable difference in all of the food waste. It's just taking on a pickled texture. And so that's a really great system just because, again, you don't have to sort anything. So that's why when working with Nowhere Public House, we decided that that's going to be the best approach because it's the most time saving for them. And it's kind of a fail safe for me. If I'm going to grab this stuff, I know that once it's pickled, there's, I'm not going to be dealing with rotting things, especially the meat products and so on. So yeah, great system for people to look into. Also something you can do at home if you want. And again, there's some great videos online. You can see where people literally take their bucket, they'll go into their garden, they'll like dig a little trench, they'll just pour it in there, cover it up with some soil, and within a couple of weeks, it's gone. And it's also not, it doesn't seem to be as attractive to wildlife either. If people are concerned about like composting and putting it out, because it's been pickled, it doesn't seem like it's as big of an attractive aspect. And funny side story, I had to go to Montreal for work in December. Went to this little restaurant with a friend that they focused on fermented foods, and she ordered a Caesar, or we both got Caesars to try, and it smelt and tasted exactly like bokashi.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I was like, oh my, I'm like, I know that smell. I'm like, oh my, I know. I'm like, and that's what it tastes like. So, anyways, it was actually a good Caesar, but again, it's just fermented food.
Well, it kind of tells you that at least when you're dealing with the end product, it's not smelling like horrible, right? Like it's smelling like something that's, I mean, of course you're not going to eat it, but it's almost palatable, the smell, right?
Oh, no, it is. It really is. Yep.
And that makes me think too, like, so, and after that, you would then say usually compost it further, or then you can go and say integrate it. Now, you mentioned someone goes and puts it in the ground, and then say, are they planting there? Or they're using that as an active planting place, so that's going to be something they'll leave and then come back to later, plant their next season, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it seems to be like you got to let it, like you can put it in there, like, because usually your trench is only like so deep, right? So yeah, once it's in there, you've covered a little bit more soil. Like, yeah, you're probably not planting in there right away, but it's something you could probably, I can't imagine. People probably can plant in there a month later and be like, okay, like.
Oh, so it's a fairly quick turnaround.
It's a very quick turnaround. Yeah. You'll see the accounts of that type of use with it, and it's like, and even actually noticing it in the hot compost piles that I placed it in, like, it seems to like I'll put it in 1 week, and then like a few weeks later, I'll go and dig back in like to see. I was like, oh, is it still like there? And it is not. Like it's just reintegrated into like that whole organic mass. That apple piece is definitely not there. So whereas, I mean, I know that I've seen, like, if it was not, if I didn't bokashi, say, a big one whole apple, it probably wouldn't be completely broken down in 2 weeks. Like, if I were to just leave it. So probably take a little more time. So yeah.
Yeah, I love seeing that you're working with nowhere to do something like that. It's kind of like what we were talking about at the beginning, right? Where there needs to be like a circular system where it's not just going linear one way. It's really working together to do that.
Yeah, totally. And that's where like we've all, so there's a few of us just trying to work up. This will probably be the first public announcement of it, but we're developing a closed loop collective between myself, Nowhere Public House, the Flower Mill Community Farm, and Fiona, who's working with them. Phil at Beautiful Field Farms and Fruit Trees, Manado, Beneshi, Dreams. We just have a group right now that we're looking at how can we look at our food system a little more holistically, from production to, restaurant and food preservation, to then compost and back to soil regeneration. And so that's what we're working on right now. So you'll probably get, you'll be one of the first to know as things kind of ramp up with this little initiative we're doing. So.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that's it's great to see. Like, I mean, I feel like there's good stuff that's kind of coming down the pipe. I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of work in the community, and I think it bodes well. I think there's a lot of people who are getting involved, and they're starting to think about these things a lot. And so I mean, on that note, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I feel like we had a great conversation, and I feel like you taught us a lot about sort of the breaking down of our waste and turning it into a usable product again.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. And I think that by all means, I have not imagined this up in my own head, like what I'm trying to do. I think that if anyone's interested in, getting into vermicomposting or just composting in general, like there's a ton of books, tons of resources, classes that you could take if need be or want to take. And some of the most inspiring stuff that I'd want to share, and I think is important to pass on to, is there's an incredible initiative in Brooklyn, New York, called BK Rot. They're like a community-based composting system, all bicycle powered, kind of human powered, and that's what I'm trying to build up to. And it's like, this is not me like, oh wow, like I'm making this up. It's like I'm just trying to. I just see a really cool thing happening somewhere else, and I'd love to see it happening more in our community. So, yeah. So, and again, I appreciate being on here to be able to talk about that. And yeah.
And before we forget too, if anyone wants to get in contact with you or get a hold of worm castings, that kind of thing, how do they go about that?
Yeah, so they can go on to it's www.ormurorganics.ca. That is the way of getting a hold of me. I have chosen to not participate in social media, well, personally, but also for this enterprise. And so they, and I guess unfortunately, like people will not find me like on Facebook anymore or anything. But yeah, so the website would be the best.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Matthew.
Thank you.